Hello and welcome to this video. JavaScript promises, the motivation and the philosophy. We will begin by introducing the synchronous nature of JavaScript code, and then we'll introduce the callback pattern and point out the drawbacks that it poses, and then we'll slowly develop a promising solution, so to speak. So let's get started. But before that, a quick introduction about myself. I am currently logging in from Bangalore and I'm working in an MNC here. It's very difficult for me to give a one line description of what I do because I have a lot of diverse skill sets, as you can see here. So let's get started. I'll begin by creating a, let's say, directory demo promise, and we'll use Visual Studio Code to open this folder. Now the first thing that I want to do is I want to create a JavaScript file. We'll call it, synchronous .js, and let's see. So assume that I have a bunch of numbers, or let's say marks. So we'll say marks is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, and we would like to get the average of these marks. So what we'll do is, in order to get the average, first we will define a sum variable, iterate from, let's see, 0 till marks dot length, and then we will say sum plus equal to marks of I, and then we can take the average as the sum divided by marks dot length, and then we'll console log the average. I'll select Node.js, and you can see that it prints 2.5. Okay, now let me create a launch configuration for Node.js, and instead of running this, we'll just run the current file. We'll call this launch current file. Okay, so that any file we open, we'll be able to run it here. Now, let's introduce some functions here to make this a little bit better and modular. So I'll just save this as 1/synchronous functions, and let's say that we have a function which says it will get us the marks, right? And this will just return 1, 2, 3, and 4. And also we'll have a function get average, which takes in the list of the marks, and it does these things for us and returns the average. And let me delete this. And also we'll have a, let's say, a main function, which is the driver code. So let's see, we will get the marks from get marks, and then we will get the average get average of marks, and then console log the average. And finally, we just have to call main and get it running. Let's see. Okay, so this is also running. Now, imagine a scenario where your marks is not available synchronously. Let's say that we are calling an API, and let's say after a 1 second timeout we are getting this result. So in that case, how will our code look? So let's me save this file. Let me call this to callback. Now, so I'll introduce a set timeout here, and we'll then set timeout, and let's say 1 second, and I want to return this value here, right? And something similar we can do here as well in get average, that this will happen in a asynchronous fashion. So in that case, what we can do is, in our driver code, instead of getting the marks, we will have to pass in a callback which will get called with our marks. So for example, get marks will accept a callback, and this callback we will be calling it with our marks. So callback, and our marks list will go here, right? So in that case we will be modifying this. Now get marks accepts a callback, and the callback will have our marks, and now we will be able to access marks here. Now something similar we can do for get average as well. So let's set timeout, and let's make it 500 seconds. We don't want to wait that long. And let me move this down below. And now instead of returning average, we will pass the average to our callback, and also accept here a callback. Make sense? Now our main, once we have got access to our marks, we then have to call get average, and then it accepts a callback, and that callback has marks first of all, and then it accepts a callback wherein we get our average back. And once we get this back, we just print our average. So let's see if this works. Okay, so this is working. Now uh, what is the problem here? The issue here is, every time we are making an asynchronous call, we are passing a callback, and now we have nested things. So this get average is nested inside the get marks callback, and the error handling will then be very tricky here. So consider a scenario where instead of these 4 marks, I don't have any marks. It's an empty list, let's say. So in that case, the average uh, will not be defined because we are dividing it by 0. So let's see what we get here. Yeah, we get a not a number value. So now in order to fix this, what we'll have to do is we'll have to make here a condition saying that if there is an if the marks list is empty, then we will not be we'll have to handle that case. So we could do it here. We could do it here, saying that if marks dot length is, let's say, equal to 0, then we console dot log empty marks list, then we return. Okay, so let's see if this works. So this is getting more and more complicated when we talk about error handling, and there could be errors here as well. Maybe the floating point limit has been reached, or the sum is too large. It could be n number of reasons that this might also fail. So this is not very manageable. So now let us introduce a fictitious scenario to understand promises. So consider a food court, and in that, let's say that there is a, you can consider it as a McDonald's outlet. So we have a customer. The customer places the order to the order counter. You can think of this as a cashier. Then the cashier, as soon as the customer places the order, the cashier immediately gives back a order number slip to the customer that contains the order number and what he has ordered as his menu. At the same time, the cashier will then forward the order to the kitchen, and now the kitchen will take some time in order to prepare the food. So once the food is prepared, the kitchen will send the food to the order counter. The order counter will assemble things in a tray, maybe keep some straws, fill up the Coke or thumbs up beverages, and then hand that tray to the customer fulfilling the order. Now, the reason these two arrows I have colored them is because these are asynchronous callbacks in nature. You can think of it like that. We don't know how much time it is going to take for the kitchen to prepare the food, and also how much time the cashier is again going to take to fill up the tray, set it on the table, fill up the beverages, assemble the food items, verify the order items with the items placed on the tray, and then hand it to the customer. So these both they are asynchronous calls in nature. Now we can handle this by using promises in JavaScript. So let's think of the states of the order. So the order could be created in the created state. It is when the customer places the order and it's just created. It could be in the preparing stage, wherein the it lies with the kitchen and then the kitchen is preparing the food. It could be delivered, the order is fulfilled in that case, and it could be cancelled could be because they accepted the order but then realized that there is no staff, or the lights went out, or some machine broke, or there could be n reasons that this order could fail. So we have a cancelled state here. Now, a promise will have corresponding states. So if the order is created, or if it is doing some work, is preparing, the promise will be in the pending state. If it is delivered, it will be fulfilled. And if the order is cancelled, we say that the promise is rejected. Now, what is a promise? A promise, if you consider this analogy, it's nothing but this order number slip which customer has received. This order number slip tells the customer that I have paid money for my food. The food is still not there with me, but I know eventually that food will get to me. Why? Because I have this slip. It says that I have paid this much amount. It has the menu items. It has my order number. So the McDonald's or the outlet is promising the customer that yes, you will get what you have ordered. So that's a promise that is made by the outlet to the customer. And the physical um entity that holds that promise or holds that contract is the order number slip. So in the world of JavaScript, a promise is an object, and that will be the physical entity which will hold the value of the asynchronous request once it gets completed. And so there are two things here. One is, if the order is fulfilled, let's say, it will have a value with it. And let's say if the order is rejected, then it will have a reason with it, that why was it rejected, right? And we call these two states as settled. So if the promise is in a fulfilled state or in a rejected state, then both of these states we can refer to as that the promise has settled. So that's the terminology that we use here. Now let's uh, think about how we create a promise in JavaScript. So let's say that so we say we take a we call the constructor of the promise, and it is nothing but an executor function. It's an executor function. Let me save this file. Let's call it um, promise syntax. So we are talking about promise creation syntax here. So in order to create a promise, you call its constructor, and then you pass in what we call as executor function. Now the syntax for this executor function looks something like this. Executor function is nothing but a function which takes in two values. It takes in two callbacks. One is resolve and another is reject. Now this resolve, we will call it when we want to fulfill our promise, and we will call the reject when we want to reject the promise, when we want to fail out, uh, bail out from it. So depending on what work we do here, we will call either resolve or we will call reject. We can call resolve with some value, let's say 3, or it could be any value. and we could call reject with an error string saying that the reason of why this failed. So let's take a look at this. So I'll uh, create a variable p and call the constructor of the promise, pass in resolve and reject callbacks, and then in the body, let me go ahead and just say resolve of any value, let's say 3 here. Now you can see that a promise was created, its state is fulfilled, and its value is 3. Now let's do the same thing, but this time let's do a rejection. Let's reject the promise saying there was some error. Okay, and it says the state is rejected and the reason is error. Now I want to create a promise that will resolve in 1 second with, let's say, this same value as 3. So in that case, what we can do is we can have a set timeout here which will call resolve, and then we can say 1 second, let's say. Now you see that as soon as this promise was created, the state is pending, and since 1 second has elapsed, so now if I type p, it will be fulfilled with the value of 3. And something similar we can do in do with rejection as well. So instead of resolving, we can reject, and and you can see it has rejected. Okay, now since we have got the basics of how to create a promise, why don't we go back to our code and change this callback and use promises instead. Let me save this. Let's call it 3 promises, and I'll revert this back. Okay, so now let's fix the get marks first. So we know that the get marks now returns a promise. So what we can do is we can say return new promise, and we need to pass the executor function. So executor function will have resolve and reject. Now we want to resolve and pass in this array here. So I'll just move this up, and instead of saying callback, we will say resolve here, and we can get rid of callback here. So now get marks is returning a promise, resolve and reject are passed in as it's the syntax, and then we are resolving it with this value here. Now similarly with get average, we can get rid of this callback. We can return a new promise, resolve reject, and I'll just move this down. And now instead of passing the average to the callback, we'll pass the average to the resolve here, and we'll save this. So now we have converted our callback based code with promise based code. But there is one catch here. See, we discussed that how do we create a promise. So generally, promise creation is not something that we will be doing very often in production or at work. A promise will already be given to us, and then we need to extract the value out of the promise. So let's talk about how to handle the promise object or extract value from it. So if you have a function which returns a promise, so we'll say p is equal to promise function. This function returns a promise. Now, in order to get the value, we use the then callable, and we will pass in a callback, and in the callback the arguments will be the value which this promise resolves to, and then we can use the value here, right? So in order to understand this, we can go back to our uh, console, and now instead of so now let's create this promise, and then we will say p. Let's take an easy case wherein we first resolve it, and then we'll go for the reject case. So this one. Now, in order to extract the value, we will call then on the promise. The value will be right here, and then let's console.log saying value is value, and you can see it prints the value. So now that we have learned this syntax, let's go back and fix our code to use promises. Okay, so this we have fixed. Now in the main, since we were passing here marks, we are passing a callback here. So now that get marks will return a promise, so we can uh, use the then. We can call then on get marks like so, dot then, and then we'll have the marks here, and then we can use the marks. So let me get rid of this. Now that we have got the marks, we will then call our get average with the marks, and this also returns a promise. So we'll say get marks, get average marks, we'll pass in the marks, and then our callback. Once we have the average, we can print it out. Okay, so let me get rid of this. There's syntax error. Yeah, let's close this out and let's run it, see if it works. We have to call dot then, right? Hmm. Uh, Not here. I'll call with marks, and then will be called here. Yeah. Okay, so this returns a promise, and we are calling then on this. So let's see if this works. getMarks.then is not a function. So this happens because getMarks.then is not a function. Yeah, so we need to call it. Let's check now. So this is working, but how is it different than our callback nesting? You remember we said that the callback has this very nasty nesting here, which makes it very difficult for us to comprehend the code because this get average is inside get marks. So how is it any different here? So it turns out that promises can be chained in the sense that this right here, instead of calling then inside the callback of the then, we could return a promise from this. So what I mean by that is we can here say return get average of marks, and that's it. We don't need the callback. And then just to make it a little bit prettier, now since this is dot then here, now we could say dot then, and this will be our average. Let's see if this works, and this works as well. So we don't have much time, so I'll summarize quickly what we have done. We have introduced promises from the perspective of async programming, in which we are waiting for a result. So promise captures the asynchronicity of the issue of the problem here, and then allows us to wait for this asynchronous result in a way that it's very easy to handle, and it also allows us to chain one promise after another, like how we saw here.